So, yes. Okay. So today I'll be talking about uses of literature and literary theory. As you can see, it is impossible to actually talk about the uses of literature without literary theory. In one sense, literature is understood because of literary theory or literary criticism. What I'm going to do with you today is to share some ideas, ideas about literature, ideas about literary theory, and how they feed on each other. How we use literary theory, or we tap into the uses of literary theory to understand the uses of literature. So this works both ways. I'd like to take you through a series of, accepted wisdom. I'd like you to think through those ideas. I'm thinking in terms of two sections, for this session. One is, of course, the part where I'll be talking a little bit about the literature itself, and then we will see what literary theory tells us about literature and its uses. Now, most of these things are actually things that you're familiar with, nothing new, but still we are revisiting them because this was how literature was thought of. At least, there has been a lot of discussion from very ancient times on about the uses of literature, starting with Plato, who banished, poetry, literature, all forms of art, because he thought they would interfere with the smooth functioning of his republic. We know right from Plato, we've had a kind of a poetics which tells us what the uses of literature are. If you look at Aristotle's statements, we have Aristotle telling us, talking about pleasure. Plato, imitation, literature is imitation, and imitation is a bad thing. But for Aristotle, we know that pleasure that we derive from imitation was not a bad thing at all. Then he also spoke about truth. Now, look at this very carefully. Even today, almost 2,000 years, 2 millennia later, when we look at literature, we find the same questions animating the discussions on literature and its uses. What is the role of truth in literature? Poetry, being just one of the genres. What kind of pleasure do we derive? In all these, ancient wisdom on the uses of literature, we find these ideas of pleasure, truth, instruction or education, and of course, expression. Aristotle spoke about the importance of expression, the importance of the spontaneous expression or spontaneous recollection of thought, of experiences. Experience is in the form of thought, experience transformed to thought. So their poetry actually serves the use of it. It actually serves expression. It produces in us the ability to be, on the one hand, spontaneous, and on the other, very tranquil. In other words, with this very contradictory definition of poetry, we get insight into one of the greatest uses of literature. Because we'll talk about this again later. It's impossible for us to be spontaneous. Not just because we are not creative, but because language prevents us from being spontaneous beyond a certain point. We are expected to use a certain language, a certain expression, certain turns of expression, certain forms of greetings, certain ritual expressions in our life most of the time. So spontaneity is not a given. It's not something that is there, because language is not ours for the taking. It is something that belongs to the symbolic order of society. Language it works because it works with other people. So Wordsworth can be seen to be navigating this very difficult terrain of how is it possible to be spontaneous? How is it possible to be contemplative? And how is it possible to be, free from too much intensity overtaking our expressivity? In other words, as postmodern thinkers use, you can talk about three terms: expressivity, effectivity, and affectivity. How do we show in language our own experiences, our own spontaneous flow of feelings, in a language that everybody understands? If you want to shape your thought, which is your expression, into a language which is understandable, language of what Wordsworth would call common men or common people, you need to actually engage in thinking, recollection, memorization, and so on and so forth, or rememorization. So literature, one of the uses of literature, according to Wordsworth, is actually a retrospective retotalization of experience. We look back at something that we have experienced, and we realize that that experience was spontaneous and it was excessive overflow. But this excessive core can be captured only in poetry. That is the beauty of poetry. We have a lot to talk about, that use of literature later. So in all these, ancient writers, we find certain principles that they consider germane, central to literature in general. For Aristotle, truth matters. And when we talk about general truth, we're talking about universal truth. In other words, when you write something, whatever you write about in literature, it loses its specificity and becomes a general truth. So waiting for Godot is not waiting for a realistic individual, someone who has a real ontological existence, someone who is out there. No, it becomes the general man, the general person, general God, or whatever. So this is one use of literature. For Wordsworth, we need to combine these two. That's exactly the core of Dryden's words too. We need to combine both these aspects of it. Instruction or education is general. It's something you can teach to everyone. Delight is personal. Absolutely personal. We'll talk about intimacy later. Intimacy, that is what Wordsworth is actually, that's the thought that Wordsworth is bringing out. So in Aristotle, we find the two aspects of the uses of literature. which are later taken up in different ways by different writers. Let's see how others looked at it. Emotion has always been associated with literature. With Wordsworth, we find, powerful emotions or powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. For Iris Murdoch, the novelist, the British novelist, literature is a disciplined technique for arousing certain emotions. Certain emotions. You're familiar with T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot would call that, would probably dispute the view and say that not certain emotions, but significant emotions. Emotions that are transmuted through the process of art from the personality or the personal dimension of emotions into a kind of art emotion. Iris Murdoch is not worried about the nature of those emotions. That is why we say literature moves us. We are moved by poetry because it arouses emotions. Thoughts can come later in recollection. In other words, good literature, touches our spontaneous emotions. Literature makes us spontaneous because our reactions to literature usually are spontaneous. We think about them later, much later, because we are not sure about what we are, signing up for when we are reading literature. What kind of pleasure? What kind of delight? We do not know. Whatever education we are going to receive as a result of reading literature, this education is something that comes after the event. The evental, the most significant dimension of literature is its ability to arouse certain emotions. Thought can come later, thought can wait. But as readers of literature, we need to understand that this particular use of literature has an amazing potential to make anyone spontaneous in his or her reaction to literature. That's why reading literature is threatening in one sense. Paul Sorkin edited an interesting collection of essays in his book, The Edge of the Precipice, Why Read Literature in the Digital Age, where he compares reading literature to the act of sitting at the edge of a cliff, of a precipice. When you're reading a book, you're always located because of the the logic of the imagination, because of the leap of the imagination into the unknown. In other words, literature puts us on the unfamiliar, strange, and dangerous terrain. Literature takes us away from the security of habits, dull habits and routine, to the beautiful insecurity or the edge of the precipice. Because literature allows us to glimpse new vistas, says Sorkin in his introduction. But at the same time, we are precariously connected to our familiar surroundings. We can read literature only against a background of primary familiarity, where we know, at least in our world, in our life, we know everything is okay, everything is fine. And then we enter the world. You read The Name of the Rose, you enter the medieval world, 12th century. And if you really let yourself be lost in the novel, it'd be impossible for you to come out of it. Because the world that is imagined by Umberto Eco is a world of the unknown. And once into that world, it's very unpleasant. It's very, very, daunting, challenging. but still the kind of vistas of knowledge that world makes available to us, the range of perceptions that makes available to us when you enter the novel, the world of the novel, right, which is a product of a leap of imagination, of creative genius of the writer, but it takes us, right, and when we wonder what's going to happen next, who is going to be murdered next, and why, right? We are at the edge of a precipice, all in the name of laughter. People are being murdered because they laugh, because they want to laugh. So literature is like rose in one sense. And how do you name a rose? And what is in a rose, right? Rose, as you know, is a perennial literary image. Poets have always loved it. Novelists have loved it, right? And, Gertrude Stein's famous statement, rose is a rose, rose is a rose. And Shakespeare's statement about rose. There are so many references to it. So what exactly is a rose? Umberto Eco would take us into that world, and without ever mentioning the word rose, probably in the entire novel, will actually make us contemplate. The edge of the precipice is the edge where you see the rose always in danger. There is that apparent simplicity of life, always under threat from an unknown world, of familiar surroundings. It's almost like having at some point a nightmare, or afternoon mare, as Arundhati Roy would say. Anytime you read the book, it takes you into a world and takes you away from your familiar surroundings, and then puts you on the edge of the precipice. Now the question is it a good use of literature to be on the edge of the precipice when all of us want security, calculation, right? Our life is so calculated to the last, very last minute, that we would rather not actually take the risk of reading. This is one of the reasons why we see a decline of the humanities in the entire, world. What use does it serve? There are so many articles and books written on this topic. Why literature matters is an interesting, article by Gillespie, where he talks about the reason why literature, matters is something that cannot be communicated. And, in his beautiful book called The Uses of Literature by Italo Calvino, we have Calvino saying that the only hope of the world is in the resuscitation and revival of the humanities. Eco has the same view, but Eco has the same view. He talks about the importance of bringing this back, in, I think, Misreadings, in his book, Misreadings. So you have all these writers, talking about the importance of emotions and importance of rousing those emotions, putting us on the edge of the cliff. We have, deconstructive writers or theorists or thinkers looking at other aspects of the uses of literature. Why is it so useful? J. Hillis Miller would say that it's useful because it is obviously non-serious. So literature is nothing but an exploitation of the possibility that any utterance may be non-serious. Because it's an interesting, dimension, because it tells us, a lot of people, right from the beginning, this discourse has been going on for centuries of what uses literature. Literature is not serious, because in literature you can say anything, and people don't take literature seriously. Remember, so many novels and works of art have been censored. We know about that, but still we know that literature is, at least by some, fraction of the population, probably a huge percentage of people think that it's non-serious. And Hillis Miller says that the reason why we should do literature is because we can exploit this particular, idea that literature, any utterance that appears in the form of literature as a work of art is actually non-serious. That capacity to write about things that people wouldn't want to write about, disturbing things. And this is a very significant use of literature, because people, you can, if you want to say something to someone, or for example, if you have a serious disagreement with your superior, your officer, superior officer, it may be dangerous for you to say something about him or her, or about the way that particular person uses his authority or abuses his authority. But you can always write a poem. You can always write a poem. You can always write a poem about authority figures. That's why you find this it's very funny, but we find this disclaimers, at the beginning of movies and sometimes novels, stories, that literature, the characters in this particular story have no resemblance to anyone living or dead, so on and so forth. And we all know that this disclaimer appears usually only in those works that are modeled on other people. And where can you do something like that except in literature? You have to include a disclaimer. It's a law, it's a rule. The law says that if there is any chance of this particular story being compared to any other particular story, then you better be sure, legally remain safe by adding a disclaimer. We have a lot of stories based on true events. It's funny, true events. So we can be non-serious, but this non-seriousness actually can produce incredibly serious artifacts. And look at Derrida looking at the same point. This positive, a powerful political weapon. So it's a kind of artistic resistance, which might immediately let itself be neutralized as a fiction. So Derrida looks at the danger of it also. And that's what people do. Whatever you write in the form of a poetry, of a poem, or in the form of a literary work of art, can be neutralized as a pure fiction. You can say whatever you want and say that it's a work of my imagination. So literature is a powerful political weapon. And since it has a dimension which is non-serious, it might be neutralized as pure fiction. I think Derrida is one of the writers, one of the philosophers who actually, dealt with it. We'll look at his other ideas on the question of the uses of literature. And when you look at, see what I'm reading now here is literary theory, examples of literary theory. These are theories about literature. But what are their uses? They tell us what literatures are used for. That's exactly what we are going to do throughout. Because there's no way to separate. A lot of people think that criticism is different from literature. That's how our syllabi, are structured. It gives, we have a paper on literary theory and we have a paper on poetry, and students would say, I would rather choose poetry over literary theory, because, in other words, they've become disciplines, different disciplines, divorced from each other. But it's impossible to divorce literary theory from literature, because they feed on each other, they live on each other, they're parasitic on each other. They don't occupy hostile territories. They're actually mutual hosts. One is a guest and the other is a host. That's not the way it works. What we call literary theory is nothing but a series of efforts by great thinkers to understand the uses of literature. And that is why we keep reading. When we look at this political weapon dimension of literature, we need to move through the thoughts of some people. I don't know. Actually, the term committed writing is a translation of a French word, French expression from Sartre. Sartre speaks about literature engagée. That is the French, I don't know how to pronounce the French word, but it's often translated as either engaged literature or committed writing. Look at Sartre's view. He talks about language as symbolic enactments of the various existential possibilities available to human beings. It's a beautiful way of looking at what language, what literature can be used for. It's symbolic enactments of the various existential possibilities available to human beings. We are all finite human beings. We are limited by our circumstances. We have a limited access. There is a limit beyond which we cannot experience reality. In other words, there is a limit to the amount of existential burden that we can carry. Therefore, every human life actualizes only a very finite, limited existential possibility available to human beings. I chose to be a teacher at some point of time, and in most cases, I end up being a teacher. You choose to be an engineer, and you end up being an engineer. Teacher, engineer, space scientist, IT professional, these are all existential possibilities. But there are other possibilities too. So many other possibilities. The life of a cancer patient, for instance. The amazing literature available now on patients who are affected by terminal illness, right? The Emperor of Maladies, for example, by Siddharth Mukherjee, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning book about non-fiction about cancer patients. The Soul of Medicine, another book. If you read those books about writers, about doctors, about various other people, even if they're not biographies or realistic, even if they're fiction, right? These symbolic performances, enactments of various human lives, push our limits. We become more capable of understanding human life. So there is the question of artistic resistance that we looked at. Still, look at the kind of power that literature has. As Theodore Adorno tells us, this artistic resistance, solely through the artistic form. What do we resist? We resist the course of the world. The world is inexorably moving in a certain direction. It has a course of its own. A course we cannot really stop in any way, right? The only way we can stop this course, resist this course, is by literature. Says Adorno, literature, that is the purpose of literature. It's a matter of resisting solely through artistic form the course of the world. Literature puts a pistol, literature tries to revolutionize the world at gunpoint because it makes it think about literature. How do they do that? They symbolically enact the numerous possibilities of life we cannot experience ourselves, thereby extending the horizons of our experience beyond our wildest imaginations. Otherwise, what do? We just live one life. All that we have access to is one single boring life. As a result, we live a life of disenchantment. How long can you be happy with a routine existence? Literature opens the window to a multiplicity of parallel universes and opens before you the door to a range of existential possibilities available to human beings. That is why Terry Eagleton calls literature a third leg or a second head or whatever you call it, an extension, a supplement to our unavoidably impoverished lives. So I said that all of us live a particular type of life. We actualize one or two existential possibilities in a lifetime. But this is unavoidable. We cannot live multiple lives. We cannot live 100 lives. We can't. Because our life is inevitably, unavoidably impoverished by limited choices. But then literature becomes a supplement. Literature supplies that what is lacking in the form of a sort of spiritual prosthesis. Prosthesis, a prosthetic leg, an artificial limb. Literature gives us a kind of an extension of life, an extension of our mind, of our body, of our abilities. Literature, in that sense, is a spiritual prosthesis. All of us need this. You can never know what you're missing out on if you don't read literature. But remember, the relative poverty of your life, the amazing richness of your life are actually, dependent on how much you don't read, how much you read. Because literature provides us with an unbelievably beautiful window on horizons that are normally unavailable to us. This is actually the essence. This essence of this idea was captured by Aristotle in his beautiful expression of catharsis, because for him, literature was cathartic in effect. Literature is cathartic in effect. If you don't read, how does your catharsis take place? If you don't read literature, how does your catharsis take place? How can you actually empathize with someone who has made a mistake? How can you enjoy the pleasures of certain kind of, retributions? How do you, when you see, justice being done or being denied, how do you react to it? We all know that literature has this amazing power to give life and to take life away. Goethe's famous Sorrows of Werther, as you know, it's believed to have led to the suicides of thousands and thousands of people across the globe. Because when you're given a new window to look at life, that new window enables you to see your own life from a new light. So keep this spiritual prosthesis. It will always be in your mind. The realms of experience, the extensions of experience, the burden of experience that you carry as a reader, with all those stories that you glean, that you learn, the ideas that you glean from stories and so on, have a powerful, enriching impact on life. Maurice Blanchot is a as you know, is a literary theorist, the author of The Space of Literature, and a number of other books, was the teacher of Jacques Derrida. See what he has got to say about committed writing. To write is to engage oneself. Remember, literature also means piece of writing. To write is to engage oneself, but to write is also to disengage oneself, to commit oneself irresponsibly. This is a very interesting deconstructive notion of irresponsibility. What do you mean by saying that literature, an author, a writer, a novelist commits himself irresponsibly? Why does he write what he writes? He writes what he writes because he's engaged in the world. What Sartre would call engaged in the production of engaged literature. But then you need to disengage yourself, right? When people start asking questions to you about why you wrote what you wrote, you don't have to give a response. You just disengage yourself. So what are you doing as a writer? You're declaring your commitment, or your commitment to change, your commitment against a certain attribute, certain attitude. When D.H. Lawrence wrote Ladies' Chariots Lover, when it was banned for so many years, why did he do that? A lot of people said that it was an irresponsible act of, creation. But what did he say? Did he ever say that was wrong of me to write it? Did Rushdie ever say that he regretted writing the satanic verses despite all the horrible horrors that he had to go through? Why didn't he do that? Because Derrida explains to us why. Because that irresponsibility is responsible. This kind of a paradox is something that you can find only in literature. You can't be paradoxical and contradictory in your real life, in your so-called serious life. Because of the unserious, non-serious dimension of literature, you have this particular privilege as a writer to be responsible in a kind of irresponsible way. This duty, Derrida writes, of irresponsibility that literature assumes as its own. This duty of irresponsibility, this duty of refusing to reply for one's thought or writing to constituted powers is perhaps the highest form of responsibility. Look at the deconstruction of the very notion of responsibility there. When the government is trying to censor a particular literary work of art, are they acting in a responsible manner? Is that responsibility worthy of the name? No, according to Derrida, that is true irresponsibility. That is resistance to change and transformation. That is, clinging on to traditions. The only way literature or writers of literature can deal with that kind of responsibility is to become irresponsible. To be irresponsible so that you can be more responsible than the so-called responsible people. Derrida wrote an amazing short book on responsibility, where he talks about the larger sense of responsibility. We all believe that as parents, as teachers, we're responsible. But are we responsible for only as a parent of the children in my house? Are we responsible for only the other who is in our vicinity, in our surroundings? Or are we also responsible for all the others? Literature, according to Derrida, is a way of being responsible to all others across the globe. And in order to do that, first of all, you will have to actually, literature is a right to absolute non-response, Derrida says. So you have the right to absolute non-response. Meaning, if somebody asks you, why did you write this? You can just say, I don't know. Just as E.M. Foster said when he was asked what happened in the caves. What happened in the caves, nobody knows. In the deep ravines of the human unconscious, we don't know what happens. Caves stand for that unconscious, for that depth of unconscious. And he himself doesn't know what really happened there, and he doesn't have to know. So there is this notion, this common notion, that whenever you approach the actual other, you will find the answers to the riddle of his stories. In fact, the story itself is the riddle. He doesn't know why he wrote what he wrote. He won't be able to explain why he won't. I mean, funny thing about Rushdie is that throughout his responses to the controversy on satanic verses, he was trying to explain himself, why fiction is different and why, and so on and so on. There's no need to do that, because you have the right to absolute non-response, says Derrida. So this is the true nature of responsibility. And this is the use of literature. Responsible irresponsibility is a kind of commitment. I think this is worth quoting. It's from Derrida's Oblique Offering. It's an interesting article from his book, from his collection of essays called On the Name. It says, literature is a modern invention inscribed in conventions and institutions, which secure in principle its right to say everything. Look at the range of the use of literature. Look at the depth of it. Literature is the only thing, only invention, which gives in principle the writer the right to say everything. No democracy without literature. No literature without democracy. And each time that literary work is censured, attacked, criticized, and of course later censored, democracy is in danger. So Derrida equates here literature with democracy. The spirit of the book, the spirit of the literary work of art, is the spirit of democracy. Every democracy must be infused with the spirit of literature. The possibility of literature, the legitimation that a society gives literature, all that goes together politically, the unlimited right to ask any question, to suspect all dogmatism. Literature is an endless fight against all kinds of dogmatism. Beliefs about, the traditional beliefs, the conventional modes of thinking. So, look at it, the reason why a society legitimates literature is because literature has that unlimited right to ask any question. We will go into it. In other words, literature is a space of non-censure. It's a space of non-rebuke, non-criticism, or non-attack, non-censorship, non-censure. Color has written an interesting article, published in Diacritics. It's a beautiful article titled "The Most Interesting Thing in the World," which is actually a quotation from Derrida, and I've quoted Derrida here. Literature can be the most interesting thing in the world, more interesting than the world. This is Derrida's famous line. Literature can be the most interesting thing in the world, more interesting than the world itself, because it exceeds the actual, but it includes its possibilities, opening the condition of possibility. Look at the beauty of the statement. What are the uses of literature according to Derrida? See, according to Derrida, literature is the most interesting thing in the world. It is more interesting than the world. And see what color adds to it. Color explains that statement and says that it is the most interesting thing in the world because it exceeds the actual, but includes the possibilities of the actual. Now, in other words, literature not only exceeds the actual, but also includes the actual possibilities as well. Then what exactly is literature doing? Literature is actually opening the window of the condition of possibility of other existential possibilities, potentials, modes of perception. In other words, we are all provided with a certain kind of life. We, as I said earlier, we actualize certain existential possibilities with the limited resources that we have. But then those actual possibilities are exceeded by literature. Because literature is one way in which you open a new condition of possibility, as Deleuze would call new lines of light in literature. In other words, human life opens out in two avenues of possibilities. One is the actual that we experience on a daily basis. The other is the virtual. The virtual works on a different condition of possibility. The virtual remains unactualized. It is your tomorrow. It is the unopened book, the unopened chapter of your life, that the books you read, literary books you read, are capable of opening up for you. So the virtual dimension of life, from which comes all the beauty and monstrosities of life, both of them are there in the virtual dimension. That's why we plan so much. We plan our life to the last details so that we can avoid virtual encounters or virtualization of new possibilities. In fact, the beauty of life lies within the virtualization of new possibilities. And literature helps us do that. Now, at this point, I stop here and move on. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a continuation. Just take time. It's almost 1 hour. Yeah, I think what I'd like to do now is I'd like to introduce to you most of the common schools of criticism. I'm told that even graduate students are going to be part of this. So I did make some changes in the last minute, but I also assume that there'll be teachers who are, teaching literature, teaching literary criticism. So in the remaining part, it would be nice if you tell me, the answer to simple questions. Otherwise, then so that at least I know that some people are actually there on the other side. I'd like you to internalize these three terms, which are philosophical terms, as you can see. When we talk about literature, we need to talk about literature because the main use of literary criticism and theory would be to answer the modality of literature, the question of how or what mode of existence literature follows. Let's first examine these three terms: ontology, and singularity. Sorry, there is a spelling mistake. That's singularity. R is missing. Okay, ontology and singularity. Let's look at this point. What exactly is ontology? Ontology in philosophy, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's actually the study of how things come into existence, how things become, how things become part of a be or a is. You say literature is. What is literature? How something comes to exist. Look at Maurice Blanchard's famous statement in The Space of Literature. It's ever harder to be sure that questions such as what is literature are not themselves already or merely literature. So here we have a really interesting question about the ontology of literature. Maurice Blanchot believes that literature doesn't have an ontology. Because the very question, what is literature, is literature. Then how can you say what literature is? Maurice Blanchot would say that literature is not an object, like new critics, talk about ontology. We'll come to that. So we need to look at how these three dimensions of literature, ontology, singularity, and hauntology, work within cultures, within the culture of literary studies in general, literary theory in general, and criticism in general. First of all, remember, there is, whenever we try to describe or try to answer the question, what is represents a certain fixed identity, an entity. Is literature an entity? Is literature a stable, static, fixed entity? Is it an object? We use the word object of literature, literary object, the poetic object. Is that an object? If you ask this question, you're asking an ontological question, right? We know that every individual is singular. Singular means no copy of that individual exists anywhere else. Absolutely unique. Singular. Different from particular and universal. In philosophy, they call it UPS, universal, particular, and singular. When we talk about the university, there is a universal concept of university. And there is a particular university called Kannur University. We talk about it. Then we talk about students. And then when we talk about students, we have a general notion of what an MA student, an MA group of students would be. We have 35 students, for instance, we have in our MA class, and all of them are particular students of a particular university at a particular point of time. But each of the 35 students represent a singular individuality. They are singular individuals. All the 35 are different from each other. So when you talk about singularity, you're talking about something of which no copy is available. Then why are these people, literary theorists, always asking this wrong question? The question is not wrong. Even when I say that 35 students in a class are different from each other and they're singular, we know that they're not completely different. There are inherent features that make them similar. And critics have always been trying to find those features inherent to literature or production of literature. Some called it, defamiliarization. Others called it, literariness. Yet others called it, charged with meaning, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, the uses of literature could be reduced to this attempt, the series of efforts by literary critics and theorists to identify the ontology of literature or literary works, to identify and emphasize the singularity, and of course, finally, its spectral or hauntological dimension. We'll talk about it. Look at John Berger. What John Berger said is, I mentioned this already. We can see the seed of this idea in Wordsworth. Poetry makes language care because it renders everything intimate. John Berger, as you know, is a novelist, the author of G, the novel that was awarded the Booker Prize winning novelist, the painter, the author of Ways of Seeing, and an amazing poet. Who has written so many articles on artworks, painting, and also poetry. And this particular quote is taken from his collection, his selected essays, the essay is titled The Hour of Poetry. John Berger actually speaks about the notion of intimacy. Those who are familiar with Lacan might be familiar with another term called extimacy. Lacan says that intimacy is impossible in language because language doesn't belong to the individual. Language is your intimate enemy. The Intimate Enemy is the title of a book on decolonization, as you know, by the Indian critic. See, the language is an intimate enemy because we cannot live without it. We cannot function without it. It's intimate to us, but it's removed from us, divorced from us. It's not us. We don't decide the rules of language. We have to obey the rules of language. Whatever intimate thoughts you have, the internal, thoughts, your consciousness, ideas that are projected by your consciousness, those ideas have to be translated in a language that is not your own. So there is no intimacy possible according to Lacan. Lacan uses the word extimacy, the practice of so identifying ourselves with somebody else who is external to us, and then preparing or showing willingness to die for them. Right? Think about a terrorist, or think about a party activist who is willing to die for the party, as someone who is a military officer who is willing to die for the country. What is he dying for? Not something that is intimate, but for a principle which is extimate, what Lacan would call the extimate kernel of our being. All of us are like that. We are prepared to die. We believe that our parents, our children, our brothers and sisters are sacred. And we are prepared to die for them. But they're not within us. They're not intimate. John Berger takes a beautiful example of leaves on a tree. He gives this example, this amazing example. He says, when you look at a tree, there are thousands of leaves on the tree. But just one word is used to capture the leaves. The amazing, the incredible diversity of the leaves being, the ontological reality of leaves, its individual particularity, its singularity is lost when you use the word leaf as a general noun to refer to all the 10,000 or thousands of leaves on the tree. Just as the word man captures man across the globe, billions of them. Every word functions that way. That is why Borges, in his amazing story called Memorias Funes the Memorias. Funes is this problem. Is a character who thinks, who experiences everything in its intimacy, in its absolute intimacy. What does that mean? It means that for Funes the Memorias, in that particular story by Borges, a dog at 9 o'clock is not the same dog at 9:01, 9:02, 9:03, 9:10, 9:20, because Funes is capable of understanding the minute transformations that are taking place, the nano transformations that are taking place within the dog. Every angle of looking at a dog changes the dog, but we still call it the dog. And he complains. He says that language cannot capture the intimate reality of being. Berger has something else to say. Berger says that that is the only way. That is why our life is, inevitably impoverished. We cannot function without concepts. That's the beauty of concepts and conceptualization. Conceptualization is the very beginning of intelligence, right? You're able to look at a leaf and call it by a leaf, and your problem is solved. Wherever you see leaves, a tree, leaf, the word serves that purpose. That's beautiful. That serves a purpose. But the question that Berger raises is, but where does the actual authentic leaf disappear? Where does it go? What about those thousands of different leaves and their diversities, their singularities? How can we capture that? And he says that is what poetry is for. That is what literature is for. What is lost in conceptualization is regained, is recovered in poetry. This is the meaning of intimacy. It's not just about transparency. No, it is something much more profound. It is understanding reality in its particularity. The kind, that is what makes Wordsworth write a poem about solitary reaper or daffodils. The kind of daffodil that he is writing about is not the daffodil that we talk about when we talk using prose. His daffodil is an intimate experience. This whole idea, it's very significant, because what exactly is the nature of literature? Is it dead? Is it alive? Is it ontologically present? Is it an ontic being, ontic entity? Or is it an ontological entity, meaning product of your mind? Or is it an ontic entity, the Heideggerian difference between ontic and ontological? Ontic is what is outside, irrespective, independent of your mind, and what is inside and part of your mind. So when you look at a tree, that tree has an ontic presence, which has nothing to do with your mind. And it also has an ontological presence, which is your mind. Now, what exactly is literature? Is it an ontological thing, or is it an ontic thing? Literature doesn't have, it is only a modality. It doesn't have a mode. That is what makes Colin Davis call, use Derrida's famous expression in Spectres of Marx, hauntology. Literature haunts us. Read Arundhati Roy's novel. You will be haunted for days by some of the scenes in the novel. Not just that, and I can give you any number of them. The great classics always haunt us. The Sound of the Fury, the novel, haunts us. Hauntology is a study of how, we are haunted by something. Supplants means replaces. Hauntology replaces ontology. There is no object. Replacing the priority of being and presence with the figure of the ghost. You know what the ghost is? Ghost is the undead. They call it spectral criticism. In spectral criticism, they use the word undead. Literature is the undead. What is the difference between the dead and the undead, or the living and the undead? The living is okay. The dead also we can understand. We don't have to worry about the dead, because the dead is gone. But the undead is the dead returning. That's literature. It's never dead. And therefore, every work of literature is a ghost. The best way to understand literature is to use the figure of the ghost. And says Colin Davis in his beautiful book called Haunted Subjects, published in 2007. He says that attending to the ghost is an ethical injunction. It's an ethical command. This is what happens to Hamlet. That's why Derrida begins Spectres of Marx with Hamlet. Hamlet's father appears as a ghost and talks about an ethical concern, an ethical problem. It's an injunction, it's a command. Take revenge, on the offender, on the murderer, on the man who killed me. Where is it coming from? It's coming from a dead man. It's a ghost talking. But then ghost becomes in deconstruction, in postmodernism or post-postmodernist writings, in the culture studies today, everywhere. You listen to, that is what Merlin Coverley in her book Ontology. Merlin speaks at length about, the main question that she raises is, why is contemporary literature and theory so saturated with supernatural, so obsessed with supernatural, ghosts? Look at the theory works, for instance. There are so many of them. We have entire genres of literature, right? We don't believe in mythology anymore, but literature is now taking the place of mythology. That's mythology for us now. There are so many works on this. Simon During wrote a recent book called Sacred, the Mark of the Sacred, The Enchantments of Modern Life. Another book. All these books actually talk about the ghost. The ghost. The beauty of the ghost, in one sense, is that the ghost is actually the terror. The reason why we are terrified by the ghost is because we know this ghost so well. Imagine, someone's sibling dies in an accident, right? And the first question that comes to the mind of that sister or brother is this: why? Why did you leave us? This is the question. Because death comes to us unexpectedly and we are not able to come to terms with death. But then, on the night of the death, after the burial, after the exhumation or the cremation of the dead body, if this very person who died appeared in the dead of time, in the dead of night, at your door, knocked on the door, it is not going to make you happy. It is the ghost returning. And the question is not, why did you leave? The question would be, why don't you leave us alone? This is the problem with literature. The question that we always ask literature, if literature is very good, is this: why don't you leave us alone? We don't want to be troubled. We don't want to be haunted. We want a normal life. This is the use of literature. So these are the three terms that you need to keep in mind. I won't be talking about it at length, but I'm keeping Samson, tell me when it's time, okay? Can just intervene. From what you told me, I think I can go on for a few more minutes anyway, at least 40 minutes or so. Am I right, Samson?
Yeah, sir.
Yeah, okay.
And I think some of them are having questions also.
Yeah, good. Okay. I can't see the chat box now, so is it okay if I take the questions later?
Yeah, sir.
Yeah, okay. Now, see, look at this. I'm taking you through very quickly through most of these critical schools, and so that I can tell you how they are useful, right? The critic insists in new criticism, the critic insists that the author's intentions in writing, even if they could be recovered, are of no relevance to the interpretation of the text. I'm sure you've heard this, you know this. Neither were the emotional responses of particular readers to be confused with the poem's meaning. Now, when you become a new critic, following new critical dogma, what use of literature are you emphasizing? You are validating organic unity. In one sense, this is the ontological term, because as you can see, I will not be mentioning the works. You can take a look at the works that I've listed. I will just be talking, looking, I will be reading out. I would like you to read the quotes, because most of these things are things that you know, but I'm trying to show you how uses of literary theory are tied to the use of literature. New criticism could be actually the beginning of the ontological turn, in one sense. But the ontological turn, not about the reality that outside. No, it's a total negation in one sense of the reality, the ontic reality outside. Right? It is a focus on the work of art as such. New critic. So when you become a new critic, you are tapping into this particular use of literature. Literature validates organic unity. It's important. It's extremely important, organic unity. But then we know that literature is not an ontological, entity. It's not easy to actually think in those lines. Again, it's new criticism. The poem meant what it meant, regardless of the poet's intentions or the subjective feelings of the reader. Meaning was public and objective, inscribed in the very language of the literary text. Another possible definition of the school, what was it trying to do? It was trying to actually highlight the value of objectivity. Because we are always controlled by our prejudices. So new critics try to tell us that there is something called a text which can become an autonomous object of art. So in works, the seminal works of these schools are mentioned here. So you can you can take a look at those texts. If the text is a well-wrought urn, then it's an object. It's an object of beauty. So new critics talk about, they validate organic unity. They cannot stand inconsistencies. They were scared of contradictions, actually, in a work of art. So the value was objectivity. How to remain objective while reading a poem. The question of objectivity is a very serious question. In a world where even political affiliations are based on emotion. So objectivity is important. I'm sure you're familiar with this too. In formalist criticism, the critic believes that literature defamiliarizes the familiar. That is, it causes us to see the ordinary in a way that jots us out of automatic ways of perceiving and acting. What exactly are these critics trying to do? What aspect of what use of literature are they trying to highlight? I'm sure you're familiar with Shklovsky's essay. Shklovsky is not talking about how to write a poem or how to write. No, he's not talking about that at all. The formal method is not to be used. It's about life. It's not just about writing literature. We spoke about it already. The automaton is the opposite of the spontaneous human being. Wordsworth spoke about the importance of spontaneity. But we are all automatons, machines that move in a certain trajectory, in a certain, on a certain, given path, beaten track. That's what we do. So formalist criticism is not actually, it's not just a criticism that emphasizes the importance of form, but especially Russian formalism, spoke about defamiliarization. Nietzsche has spoken about the familiar, the problem of the familiar. He said this familiar is what we actually know so much about that we never know anything about it. And Shklovsky takes examples not from literature, he takes examples from real life. He says that automaticity, this practice of being machines or mechanical, can affect all of us. He is attacking habitualization, a certain habit formation. He says that habitualization affects not only art forms and literature, poetry, but also wives and clothes. This is the problem with the automaton. Lacan has an interesting article called The Automaton and the Touche. Touche is a French word. Automaton is what is predictable. The machine. The one that gets up in the morning, has his breakfast or her breakfast, and then goes to school, college, comes back at 5 o'clock. What T.S. Eliot has beautifully captured in his poetry. That person, that clerk, that teacher, who follows the automated path, right? He's the automaton. But in recent books of culture, culture studies like, for instance, Bernard Siegel's beautiful book called The Automated Society. He talks about how human beings now have two absolutely significant dimensions. One is automaticity, being an automaton, and the other is the autonomy. When we talk about, mobile phone use, we talk about addiction. We are scared about children being addicted to mobile phones or any other technological gadgets. In other words, that fear is the fear of being an automaton. We don't know what we're doing because it's a machine that's calling the shots. And what do? How do you handle it? You handle it because you remain autonomous. Even when you have to be automatic, you have to depend on automatic, facilities or gadgets. So formalist criticism must be understood as a theory that explains a certain function of literature, a use of literature, which is critiquing the automaton that human beings are, that life is, obstructing the course of the world. Because literature, as Derrida says, is more familiar, it's more beautiful than the world we live in. Now, in psychoanalytic criticism, the fundamental assumption of the critic is that human beings are motivated, even driven by desires, fears, needs, and conflicts of which they are unaware. You cannot do a psychoanalytic criticism of a paper in the discipline of physics, for instance. You just read it as it is given to you. In literature, you are capable of applying any of these approaches to the reading of literature. What exactly is the use of literature being referred to here by psychoanalytic critics? What are they focusing on? Critique of consciousness. We could call this the Freudian turn. So it is the duty of literature to critique, to attack our conscious lives, the realm of our consciousness, and to show how desires, fears, needs, and conflicts, which we always hide in our real life. Desires, fears, needs, and conflicts, which we don't, in one sense, hide because we may not even be aware of them. At the linguistic level, we may not be aware of them, or we may hide them. But these fears, these desires, in fact, motivate most of our actions. Ernest Jones in 1949, with this amazing psychoanalytic interpretation of the delay in Hamlet, right, inaugurates the Freudian turn in literary criticism, in one sense. So one use of literature is to actually critique the conscious dimension of our being and bring out the light on the other side, the light on the other side of darkness. That is what it does. We have archetypal criticism. Archetypal criticism is again, validating a value. What does it do? Archetypal critics interpret a text by focusing on recurring myths and archetypes in the narrative. I'm sure you are familiar with this. But when you relate it to literature, that represents the Jungian turn. Earlier we saw that in the earlier slide, we saw that we were talking about the Freudian turn, because Ernest Jones and company and a number of others made Oedipal readings of Hamlet. It is basically an Oedipal reading, because Ernest Jones believed or theorized in that particular book that Hamlet's delay is caused by Oedipus complex. But when we come to Northrop Frye, The Anatomy of Criticism, Fables of Identity, and Archetypes of Literature, those essays, those works, we find a Jungian term, because Jung is the psychologist or psychoanalyst who differentiated between, or divided the unconscious into two, the collective and the personal unconscious. And his focus was actually, Northrop Frye focused on the collective unconscious. Literature actually relates and connects us to mythologies, to our past, to the role of sea, sun, earth, etc. in our lives, so that we never forget the origin, forget ourselves. That's an amazing use of literature if you think about it, validating our mythological past and bringing before us a picture of life which is interconnected, which is the past connected, which connects the past with the present with the future, and so on and so forth. The critic attempts to show how the virtues of narratives relate to the virtues of selves and societies, or how the ethos is actually a one word for collection of virtues. How the ethos of any story affects or is affected by the ethos of any given reader. It's a new recent school of criticism. What is it called? It's called ethical criticism. See, here the critic attempts to show how the virtues of narratives relate to the virtues of selves, people, individuals, and societies. In other words, according to this reading, there is no art for art's sake. There is no new critical focus on the structure of writing or the formalist, preoccupation with the structure of writing. No, every writer, every narrative has ethos, collection of virtues that the narratives are based on. And this particular story affects, or the ethos of the story affects the reader. And the ethos of any story is definitely affected by the ethos of any given reader. Look at the importance of ethical criticism. That it's actually not validating mythologies, but validating the ethical dimension of life. Hillis Miller, The Ethics of Reading, and Martha Nussbaum. By the way, Nussbaum's writings, book, especially Love's Knowledge, is an interesting book that talks about the kind of knowledge made possible by literature. You can read the novel, that you're studying, any novel, from an ethical perspective. Here, we have reader response criticism. The critic insists that there is no objective work or literature lying on the classroom table. Bleak House is simply, by Charles Dickens, right? The assorted, collected accounts of the novel that have been given or will be given. The true writer is the reader. Is there a novel called Bleak House? Or is it just what we call Bleak House today is nothing but the collected, tellings and retellings of the story of the novel? Nothing else. So in reader response criticism, we find, in contrast with the new critical focus on the text, we have a move towards the reader. So this particular school of criticism validates the reader. We could call this the affective turn, the affective stylistics of Stanley Fish, right? Whose work is there a text in this class. He came up with this amazing, this beautiful notion of interpretive communities, that every community. The reason why you understand what I'm saying is because we belong to the same interpretive community. So there are interpretive communities that actually, look at the meaning and interpret the meanings of words. So the use of this particular theory would be to validate the reader against the principles of new criticism and other theories which do not validate, which literally sideline the reader. In this, which is, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. What does the critic try to do? It was originally intended as an an interactive session. Then since the number is more than 100, I thought it would not be practical. So that is why you have the name appearing later. So in structuralism, critic attempts to apply to literature the methods and insights of modern linguistics and anthropology, and largely ignores what science actually say and concentrates instead on their internal relations to one another. Structuralism is not a difficult theory, but it's not a difficult theory of literary theory, which can stand apart from literature. No, The reason why we have structuralist reading is because it brings out the use of literature as a critique of atomism and individualism. Because we have the relational turn. Structuralism validates and valorizes relations. Look at the last part. According to structuralism, nothing exists on its own. Everything is a structure. In other words, it is related to something else. The relation may not be very obvious. The relation of the word evil to good may not be obvious, but they're related. All the binaries that we use, day, night, life, death, man, woman, all the binaries may not look related, but they are related. And this, in other words, in psychoanalysis, psychology, we have Kenneth Gergen's beautiful book called The Relational Being. And we have Levinas, we have a number of philosophers who actually focus on the relational dynamics of human life. And this is what literature teaches us. Literature actually critiques individualism and teaches us how to understand the relational dimension of life. And structuralist criticism tells us how to do it. Another aspect of structuralism would be this. Here we have the semiotic turn. Structuralism, one criticism against structuralism is the idea that human beings within structuralism, or according to structuralists, human beings have no role. We are all part of the passive structures that we inhabit or that inhabit us. This is one criticism of structuralism that we have, even in Althusserian Marxism, where Althusser is, the Marxist who introduced the notion of the apparatuses, the ideological and repressive apparatuses, ISA and RSA. But we all know that these structures are important. These structures are part of our life, and we cannot, in a wholesale fashion, dismiss the value of the apparatuses. All kinds of apparatuses, the justice system, the judicial system, the legal, the parliamentary system, the bureaucratic system, the educational system, the cultural system, you name it. All these systems are structures, based on structures. And we inhabit those structures. There is no escape from that structure, actually. So there is this question. Earlier, this aspect was completely ignored. Structuralism told us that no, when you read a work of art from a structuralist perspective, you understand how literature can be used to validate the apparatuses. You can use literature also to attack and destroy and dismantle the apparatuses of capture, as they're called. Let it be the police system, any system we are actually involved in. Our life is embedded within a multiplicity of apparatuses. If you want to apply for admission to a college, you need to go through the process, the structure of the bureaucratic process of downloading an application, filling it out, producing the required certificates, and so on and so forth. How can we function without that structural hierarchy? It's impossible for us to function that way. We have the apparatus of reservation. We have the apparatus of selection of entrance and so on. These are all apparatuses, and we need to validate them. We can always find faults within the structures, and we can rearrange the structures, dismantle them if we want, but we need to validate the structure too. So that's a value. That's an important value. Family is a structure. There are problems within the structure, we know, but the system as such requires validation. The apparatus is useful, more useful than harmful, at least within the context of our country, our culture. Structuralism serves this purpose of connecting us semiotically. The signs are connected. Culture is nothing but shared meaning, shared signs. Now, in this kind of criticism, what does the critic do? The critic actually focuses on certain lapses and omissions in the text. For in order to say anything, try to see if you can come up with it. There are other things which must not be said. The critic attends to the text's political unconscious, to what is unspoken and inevitably repressed. So what do we do? In what way is Marxist criticism useful? It helps us identify social symptoms. It's an important word in political philosophy, especially in the writings of Zizek and others. Social symptoms. Symptom is, as you know, is a sign of a disease, the sign of a problem. Is a sign that a system is not working. It's like a short circuit or some kind of a problem in the electric circuit. If there is a mistake, is a problem in the connection, if wires are crossed, it doesn't work. There's no electricity. If something in the body goes wrong, symptoms appear. Social symptoms are certain problems in the society that we identify as dangerous to the well-being of the people. Marx found that the main problem of literature, of any time would be to identify the social symptoms. How does the symptom appear? You get up in the morning and then you have a slight pain somewhere on the side of your neck. You feel a little worried because all the elements in the body work together. But some of them, for some reason, stand apart. This is what Marxism does. It tries to bring out that hidden political unconscious. Just think about the political unconscious of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. It validates a certain kind of life form. The rich and the poor, it never is worried about the poverty of the poor. The book, actually, the poetry indulges in the resplendence of the rich, and also indulges in the poverty of the poor. You don't see any suggestion in the poem anywhere that this has anything to do with the social structure. It's like we have renounced our old values of tradition. That's not the reason why there is so much suffering in the world, in T.S. Eliot's world, in the wasteland. No, that's not the reason. The reason is political, and that political unconscious is repressed in the work. So Marxist critics, they do symptomatic readings. They call it symptomatic readings. That is what Reading Capital, the book I mentioned here, published in 1965, is a perfect example of symptomatic reading. Looking for lapses and omissions in the text. The things that you do not say so that you can say something. You find them out, and within that gap, you find what you're guilty of, what the writer is guilty of. The fundamental idea being that in any reading of literature, no reading is innocent. Louis Althusser beautifully puts it in his essay. No reading is innocent. Therefore, you need to find out for yourself what you're guilty of while reading. Probably we are all guilty of reading The Wasteland in the wrong way. We are not aware of what was actually suppressed and repressed so that something else could be said. We did not notice the social symptoms, for instance. So literature can be used to identify social symptoms and fight oppression and repression of all kinds. A historical critic reads about the peasant revolt of colonial India today and asks, what does this event tell us about the spirit of the age, the case in which it took place? But in new historicism and cultural materialism, the critic asks a different question. What does this event tell us about the spirit of the age? That's a historical question. But in new historicism, cultural materialism, the question will be different. What does this story or history tell us about the political agendas and ideological conflicts of the culture that produced that particular story, that read that particular story in the 1930s? So this is what new historicism does. It's a very, and British cultural materialism is the British variety, or you could say new historicism is the American variety of cultural materialism. Both are the same. They believe that culture is a product of material effects. The things that are there in the society, the material objects in the society, the tools that you use, the tools of labor, the means of production, all these are what constitute your culture. So you need to understand, in order to understand culture, you need to understand how they function. What purpose does this literature, in this, literature retrieves the past. The historic turn, the title of a book, the cultural turn, all this can be identified here. Probably, Walter Benjamin's, the Frankfurt School of Critics, his famous, declaration is valid here, if you think about it. Every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably. So new historicists, critics, and cultural materialists go back to a recent, of a past, not necessarily recent, and they retrieve the past. They talk to us, they tell us why that is important. Terence Hawkes, for instance, is another one of those, so-called presentist theories. Talks about, history as something that is trapped in our thought. The experience of being chalked on some food, trapped in the thought. They use a procedure called the Heimlich maneuver. It's a process through which you push, the person, the chalking person in a certain manner. You apply pressure, and then the thing that you swallowed comes out. It's called Heimlich procedure. It says that this is similar. This process of bringing out something from the past. It's a metaphorical Heimlich procedure. You apply pressure. Samson, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Did you call me now?
Sir, shall we conclude?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I think, I will just probably run through a few more quickly. I will not be explaining this, but you can just take a look at this. These are different kinds of critical schools that serve a certain, that highlight a certain use of literature. It has always been there. These three books are actually three waves, right? Simon de Beauvoir's, that could be the first wave, Betty Fred in second wave, Susan Fellow the third wave, and you can see LGBT criticism, right? Where the heterosexual imaginary is questioned. So literature, as Sedgwick talks about in epistemology of the closet, we have a closet epistemology. Every individual LGBT person, is respected. So literature does that. Then you have to understand our own oppression, our own domination by the colonial masters, and the important texts that go with it. It would have taken a long time, but I'll just quickly go through this. Deconstruction validates marginality, it reaches out for the other, right? And what ecology or eco-criticism does. All these all these various schools of criticism actually highlight one or other use of literature. Covering has, in Edward Said's famous book, Covering Islam, there's got two meanings. Covering in the media sense of covering an event, and also covering means hiding displacement. So covering, this is actually another use of literature. Then there are, especially for researchers in various fields and recent fields, would actually be advised to look at these emerging, trends in literary criticism and to understand how they enrich our perception of the uses of literature. My main idea is that, maybe this is my concluding, thought. I've taken this from Rita Felsky. Rita Felsky's famous book, The Uses of Literature. Remember, Rita Felsky is an amazing critic, a literary theorist. And I think in October, first week or so, she is organizing an international seminar on literary criticism, literary theory. Please, I have registered. You can register, I think. I don't know if they have closed the registration. It's a paid seminar, but we wrote a letter to Rita Felsky personally, and she responded to it by saying that she gave us free entry. I think if the entry is free, it would be, worthwhile. Please, you can Google and find out if Rita Felsky's seminar called On Resonance is still available. I mean, if it's still, if you can still register for it. So Felsky has written a number of books, but this is one that is useful to us today. There is a dawning sense among literary and cultural critics that a shape of thought has grown old, a new birth in the offing. We know only too well that the oiled machine of ideology critique, literature was ideology critique at some point, symptomatic reading another point, the X-ray gaze of symptomatic reading, ideas that seemed revelatory and wonderful 30 years ago, ideas like the decentered subject, the social construction of reality, they have dwindled into shop-worn slogans today. And what virtue remains in the act of unmasking when we know full well what lies beneath the mask? So she introduces a new kind of reading. She says she doesn't call it a manifesto, she calls it an unmanifesto, because she doesn't want to appear as if she is sermonizing. But the idea is there's various modes of reading will appear, and various literary theories will also appear. But all these literary theories will ultimately help us to understand the uses of literature. With this, I conclude now, the question session. Over to you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Sir, first of all, sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. That's fine.
Yeah. And most of the participants want to know whether you could share the PowerPoint.
No, PowerPoint won't be shared.
Yeah. Sir, should we read out the questions, or will you be reading the questions?
Oh, no. Let me see if I can see the.
If you want, we'll read it out for you.
Yeah, please read out. Let me see.
Okay.
I have them here.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Who's this?
This is Fijal. I'm just reading out the questions.
Hi.
So we have a question from Satish and S. He has asked, could you please give us a brief introduction about ethnicity and literature in research?
That's a big question. Totally, let me just read that. Fijla, what is it again?
Could you please give us a brief introduction about ethnicity and literature in research?
That's a very broad question, Who is that questioner? Can that questioner please tell me and narrow down the question? I think it's ethnicity is relevant. There's a lot of discussion going on. What exactly is the question? I'm unable to get the question.
We have the participant here, Satish and yes. He is there.
Can you ask that question directly? What exactly do you want to know? Suggestion doesn't seem to be on. So shall we move on to the next question?
Next question.
Yeah, the next question is by Dhara Vinod. She has a question on spiritual prosthesis. She has quoted C.S. Lewis, we don't have a soul, we are a soul, we have a body. So the question is, why is spirituality taken as a prosthetic or supplement? Why is literature considered as an escape and not as an essence?
Why spirituality is taken as
a prosthetic or supplement, and why is literature considered as an escape and not as an essence? And she has substantiated with the C.S. Lewis quote.
it's not literature is not an escape from spirituality. You know, there was a very interesting, that's I think an interesting question that is, you know, literature is, there's another interesting definition of literature called, I remember it's called the disimprisonment of the soul of fact. Literature disimprisons, I mean, the opposite of imprisoning. In other words, when we reduce life to a series of facts, the soul is lost. So what literature gives us, or what poetry gives us, is actually the true soul of it. You know, conceptualization. Yeah.
Can I ask the question? I think she has misinterpreted it.
No.
Yeah, the questioner herself, sir.
Okay. Questioner.
Yeah.
Just introduce your name. What's your name?
Yes, my name is Dhara.
Okay.
Dhara Parmar.
What is your question,
Yeah,
ma'am?
and first of all, I would really like to appreciate to share your wonderful thoughts with us. I mean, it's really informative, very insightful. So thank you so much for that. And I would want to repeat this question is when we were talking about spiritual prosthesis, right?
Yeah.
So we were talking about how it acts as a supplement of our impoverished lives. So I always think whenever I'm reading these literary works or poems, I always think I go back to C.S. Lewis thought that when he said that we don't have a soul, like we are a soul and we have a body. So similarly, why literature, when it comes to literature, a lot of people find it to be an escape from this impoverished life that we have, but why isn't it considered as the mere essence of life, like spirituality is, right? So I was comparing metaphorically literature and spirituality both as synonymous.
Yeah. I think that's a question we both would like answered, because reading on the one hand is, on the wane. It is dwindling. People are not reading much these days. People are very calculated about their time, about their plans. So they don't find any meaning in reading a long novel or even trying to understand a poem. You're right about that fact, because it's the spiritual dimension that literature expresses mostly. And the spiritual dimension, as you implied, is what actually doesn't appear. It's not obvious, but that's what makes our life really worth living. So literature, in that sense, the reason why people see literature as an escape from all this is because they think that there is this non-serious dimension of literature, that aspect, And since it is some kind of a non-serious engagement, it is seen as escape. But if spirituality is an essence of life, then what we are missing out by ignoring literature is the very essential aspect of life. So that is one more reading, see, literature, as you indicated, implies spirituality. It is actually the spiritual essence. It gives us the spiritual essence of life. It should not be thought of as something we should escape into from our normal life. No, it is actually what produces for us the value, the true spiritual value of a life. But that's not the way it is looked at. It's true. I agree with you that literature must be thought of in its essence as a spiritual occupation or a preoccupation, and must be treated that way, given so much importance that way, and so on. Not as something that like drinks and other leisure activities. No, this is much more spiritual. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean, it validates.
Now, Vijala, over to you again. Any other questions?
So we have a question from Pramila Johnson. I'll just read it out. First of all, thanks for this edifying and insightful session. So we are very familiar with some theories like stranger king theory, contact zone theory, third space theory, and so on. Can you kindly share some of the most recent theories in literature?
You know, the recent theories are the theories that I actually mentioned towards the end of my talk. Discourses on the post-human theories, you know, theories on the Anthropocene, and the ones you mentioned actually, you know, Louis Pratt's Contact Zone and George Simmel's Strangers, the Stranger. You know, all this is, of course, these are all offshoots or spin-offs from Derrida's deconstructive thinking. And then, of course, you know, various forms of feminism that we did not speak about, like intersectional feminism, you know, sexual positivity, and different. All these are the theories that even spatial studies has become very popular now. Then, you know, Deleuzian thinking on the rhizomatic, you know, dimension of literature, of life in general. These are the new constellations of thought. In political philosophy, you know, related to literature, you have, you know, a number of works like the post-national constellation. You know, Arjuna Apadre's work on the minorities, his famous book called The Geography of Fear. And I think it's, there are, I don't know what you mean by new theories. I would say that probably the latest theory, if you want to talk about the most recent, would be Rita Felsky's Post-Critique. That's actually the title of a recent book by her. She says that we have entered the post-critical stage. So these are possibilities, you know, theoretical possibilities of understanding literature, but they're just books that are being, you must have mentioned, the book I mentioned, Ontology, was published last to around 5 months back, I think in 2020, yeah, 2020. But surprisingly, that the Audible edition, the audiobook edition is available on Audible. Those who have Audible can get that book, get hold of the book. Audible is now doing a good job of trying to actually make theoretical text available to us. Zizek's masterpiece is available now on Audible. I mean, it's paid, but it's worth it. So there are several theories on intersectional theory of intersectionality, how race, gender, language, etc., all together play a role. You know, all these are important. And the other questions of race, ethnicity, theories on all these are, I think, very relevant, and they are the latest theoretical configurations. I can't think of all of them, but, you know, just off the cuff, these are the things I can think of.
Yeah, Nandana. Shall we
Okay,
move
so
on?
Dhara Vinod has raised one more question. Are we reading Rumi to contextualize into the specific cultural social setting, or to explore the mysticism and its historical trajectory? Actually, she has written a very long message.
Yeah,
Shall I read it out? Or
Should I do it to like directly? Should I read it out to him?
Yeah, Dhara,
yeah,
please.
yeah, please, please.
yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
Yes. So, when we were talking about objectivity, you know, importance of objectivity in poetry, right? So my question was that when we are reading, you know, Jalaluddin Rumi's words, so is it, you know, are we reading it with the aim of attempting to contextualize his words in the specific social and religio-cultural setting of his time, or to explore the historical trajectory of his own mysticism that he had with his life, or with his life with Shams Tabrizi? How do we see that?
No,
Objectivity
actually,
or subjectivity?
thank you for that question again. Interesting question. First of all, remember that I was not talking about, I was not saying that poems should be approached objectively. I was saying that a particular school of criticism called New Criticism wanted to highlight the role of objectivity. Whereas reader response criticism did not really support that notion. Phenomenology criticism completely attacked that notion. So, first of all, please remember that I was trying to relate various theories of literature and also validate all those theories as the uses of literature. So, before I come to your question is still valid. How do we understand all writers? If you read, for instance, Elisha Fack's, the 40 Rules of Love, right? Have you read that novel?
No, I've yet not, but I
love that.
Yes,
novel.
it's in my recommendation
That
list
novel,
now. Yeah.
it is actually the story of Rumi and Shams Tabrizi, told from a contemporary perspective. Okay, totally contemporary perspective. You have an American mother of 40 named Ella, who who is living a typical family life, who falls in love with a new Rumi, a kind of a guy, an American, who has become a Sufi. I mean, they fall in love over the male. But then in parallel, there is this amazing story of Rumi's relationship with Tabrizi, Shams Tabrizi.
Yes.
And when you read the book, what you really see is an amazing application of an ancient story to today's life. How is spirituality important to us today in the contemporary? Now, I specifically mention that book because I'm sure some of you might have read this book. This book is also available on Audible. If you're an audiobook fan, you can read that. It's beautifully read, by the way. This particular book tells you exactly how ancient, beautiful stories of the ancient, like that of Rumi and Al-Shams, can be read through literature. So there is an interesting term that she uses, sweet blasphemy. Okay, that's a term she uses. Sufism was sweet blasphemy. What they did was, in their own sweet way, they loved God, and the way they loved God actually was totally against the traditional notions of spirituality. So there is this particular American lady is given a book. She's a book editor, is given a book to edit. That book is written by a man, a Sufi guy. That title of that novel, in the novel, is Sweet Blasphemy. It shows you exactly how you cannot objectively capture, there is no point in objectively capturing the history of Rumi without relating to the present. Elisha Fack masterfully does that. She creates that bridge between the times of Rumi and the times of present-day America, and how people with the same kind of bend of mind can come together, and parallelly she develops that.
That's amazing. Yes.
There are other stories too, by the way, that makes use of Sufi wisdom. We don't have the time to go into that, but this one would be a highly readable kind of stuff. Any other questions?
Yes, I have like a lot of questions to ask you, but time doesn't permit. So.
Yeah, probably you can, get my WhatsApp ID and probably chat with.
Please do so. Yeah, please do so. Yes.
Or email. That's not a problem.
Yes.
Any other questions, Samson?
No, sir. The questions are over. So, shall we conclude, sir?
Yeah.
And personally, from my part, thank you, sir, for accepting the.
Let me just, before you, conclude. For those who asked me for the slides, the reason why I don't share slides is not because of the hard work I put into designing them. Those slides would make no sense to any one of you. If you have noticed, those slides contain nothing but quotations. But the soul of the lecture is myself. I don't think it's on the slides. Slides, probably you might have liked the slides and you can design them. All the quotes are quotes, they're not my words. But what I said are not on the slides. Yeah, over to you.
Okay, sir, thank you. Next, I invite my colleague to deliver the vote of thanks. Shaina ma'am.
Okay, good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Respected resource person of the day, Dr. K.K. Kunhammad, sir. Assistant Professor, Department of Studies, Dr. Janaki Ammal, Campus, Kannur University, Dr. Dominic Thomas, Principal, S.E.S College, Dr. Sajish TJ, IQSC Coordinator, Dr. Soumya Maria Jacob, Program Convener, Mr. Samson Rajan, Head of the Department, other faculties, and dear participants. The last 2 hours was really an enlightened session by knowing more about the use of literature and literary theory. First and foremost, on behalf of the English Department, S.E.S College, I thank the resource person of the day, Dr. K.K. Kunhammad sir, who despite his busy schedule has found time to grace this occasion with his knowledge. Thank you, sir. We are grateful to our beloved principal, Dr. Dominic Thomas, for his words of encouragement and motivation. His able guidance and support has always encouraged us. Thank you, sir. I would like to express words of gratitude to our IQC coordinator, Dr. Sajish TJ, for his support and commitment. My heartfelt thanks to Dr. Soumya Maria Jacob, the program coordinator, and other faculties for the technical support and guidance in all our efforts. I owe special gratitude to Mr. Samson Rajan, head of the department, who have worked hard to ensure the success of this program. Last but not the least, I thank all the participants for your cooperation in making this webinar a resounding success. Once again, I thank you all. Thank you.